Hello, everybody. Might be. Hello, everybody. Sorry for the late start. I was just ironing out kind of a script-like presentation for what I want to talk about today. Again, I apologize that I don't schedule my streams in advance, but when I have something to say, it comes from the heart, and I have to say it on the spot. So, somebody was commenting. Let me move my dinner here and get my water. Bring the mic a little bit closer. Somebody here was saying that I've criticized Jason on this, and I actually am going to talk about that here in a moment. It is correct. I have criticized Jason Unruh on this. But that's really just because I was rather naive, and I think I placed too much stock in my original criticism that first worlders don't really benefit that much. I mean, we do benefit materially, but that's not the reason why uh, third worldism is correct. I mean, yeah, we do benefit from cheap resource and mineral and food imports. You know, the fucking t-shirts that are made for pennies on the dollar in sweatshops in Bangladesh, the coffee from Brazil and West Africa, the cheap fucking phones that get imported from China and Taiwan. So, in some regard, we do benefit from the consumer economy that has been given way by the new neoliberal order. And first world workers have benefited for a while. But it's not the only reason why that's the case. Basically, in my original talk, I put too much emphasis on ideology. I underestimated how much workers materially benefit. And this was also around the time the BLM protests were surging. So I thought this was going to be, at the very least, like a 1905 moment where something really big happens or something meaningful manifests out of it. But lo and behold, it's a nothing burger. So that being said, let me get my little presentation out here. A couple quick announcements. First off, shout out to my Patreons. Thank you very much for the money. I'm actually using the Patreon money that I just cashed out, a few $100s. I'm going to be using this to buy a high quality microphone and possibly a new and better webcam here pretty soon. Something of a Twitch stream debate bro quality. That's what I'm looking for here when I go shopping. I'm just waiting for that Patreon money that my donators have generously given onto me to upgrade my studio equipment. I have like maybe one or two videos that are coming that are scripted that are going to be with this piece of shit right here, this little microphone that I've been using that people have been complaining about. But afterwards, here in the next week or so, it's going to be over and we're going to be entering the era of the quality mic and hopefully the quality camera as well. Speaking of which, I got a few scripted videos coming out this week. One after another, back to back. I'm already halfway done editing this new one. It's just going to be a basic political talk on the difference between leftism and liberalism, just as like a basic political guide for people out there, just for the layman, because I'm expecting an influx of subscribers when my talk with Veritas and Man in the Wall hits the internet. Which, by the way, I had a debate / conversation with Veritas not too long ago. He's going to be uploading it to his channel here pretty soon, probably Friday. He's an anarchist YouTuber, and we had a good long conversation, and it was a nice, productive conversation. But anywho, let's talk. I'm going to read a couple comments before we get started. Does third worldism mean revolution is 100% impossible? No. Third worldism basically says that the potential and the likelihood that revolutions break out is going to not be in the imperial core countries, the first world countries where capitalism is at its most stable and at its most ingrained and entrenched, not just materially, but psychologically as well, that it's actually going to be in the periphery. It's going to be in the countries where capitalism has either failed to take off, it's failed to develop, or it hasn't really developed that well. The countries where capitalism has failed, where there are weak links in the chain, where the capitalist system hasn't really taken off and entrenched itself. So historically, this has happened in many countries at and below the equator, as well as in Eastern Europe. And many communist and socialist and even democratic basic bitch shitlib movements have failed. Many of them have failed because due to these countries inherently being less entrenched and less stable, that means an opportunity for a coup d'etat is open because the political structures in many of these second and third world countries are weak. Now, the political structure within the communist world was relatively strong. What happened was it was ultimately betrayed internally by sects of its own bureaucracy. That's really ultimately what it came down to. It was just really just get rich quick scheme. I have a little meme I want to show you guys real quick. Let me dig up this meme because it exemplarizes exactly what I'm talking about. Here we go. Got a little meme that I'm going to bring up on screen. Let's see. Sure, we'll do entire screen. This is the meme I'm talking about right here. See that? Will you push the button? You set human progress back nearly a century, but it's right here. But you get to star in a Pizza Hut commercial, and there's Gorbachev, and he hits the button. So yeah, that's the general idea, but I digress. I'm getting away from what I originally wanted to talk about. So anyways, long story short, it has been historically and contemporarily the countries where capitalism is less entrenched, where it's failed to take off, where it's very poor, the people are very downtrodden and live very shitty and difficult lives. It's generally been the periphery countries that have been the ones with the highest amounts of revolutionary potential, and that for communism to succeed, we need to start taking a very global look at this phenomenon. We need to take a very global look at the movement in general. We need to stop focusing. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't focus domestically on domestic issues, not at all. I'm just saying we need to start taking more of a global internationalist look when it comes to the development of socialism. After all, the ruling class are constantly exporting capitalism. They're constantly trying to protect their interests and fight for their interests on a global stage. So should we. So, like I said, I've already stated the reasons why I was opposed to it, but otherwise, a lot of it just came down to naivete and just lack of pragmatism. I kind of vastly overestimated the development of class consciousness and the development of radicalization rates within the United States. I mean, people got radicalized during the BLM protests, and the country is becoming more and more polarized. But the problem is that there aren't nearly as many socialists as I'd like there to be. There aren't nearly as many socialists within the United States. So I'm going to go through a list of reasons, and I'm going to describe in detail 5 different reasons why I believe third worldism is correct. That's right. I uphold third worldism, and I actually have strategies and ideas of my own and what we can do about it afterwards. But anywho, sooner or later, I've got the script done, and I've honestly, dude, a lot of it's just come down to personal laziness. I've had the script done for a while. I just need to set up this backdrop right here and finally shoot it. Personally, yeah. But it's gonna come sooner or later. I promise. It's gonna happen. I'm sorry to keep you all waiting that long, but anyways. So let's talk about this presentation. 18 is a crowd. 18 is enough people. 5 reasons why third worldism is correct. So, reason number 1. First world workers are indoctrinated to a much deeper degree than second and third world workers. So, the news media, the history texts, the colleges, the think tanks, the politicians, political commentators, and otherwise all of the people and routine channels that we go to get all of our political information and all of our historical information is bankrolled by the big bourgeoisie. It's bankrolled by wealthy capitalists who own it all and who it is in their direct material interests to tell the history and tell the news, if not outright make the news, from a very jaded, cynical perspective that aligns with their material interests. And as a result, because of all these think tanks that are all funded by neoliberal billionaires, because people look to get their information, and this is where people get their information and soak it from, they're going to be soaking it from an extreme right bias, and it's going to entrench liberalism in people's minds, because everywhere you go, there's liberalism. It's all being portrayed from a liberal perspective. Like, that's the culture, that's the society, that's the news media, that's the history. Like, literally, it's just deeply entrenched liberalism wherever and whenever you go. Even if you crack open a history text to read about communist regimes, you're going to hear about dictatorship, abuses of power, authoritarianism. You're going to hear the author go in to describe their anti-communist credentials and shit on these countries for a solid paragraph to 2 paragraphs at the onset of the book, before going on to describe why these countries weren't nearly as bad as people think, and they actually did a lot of good while they were around, and why the bad things that went on in these countries are actually a lot more complex and nuanced discussions than what are initially led on and what people are initially taught about. As a result, people are entrenched, like liberal ideology is entrenched. It's embedded in the culture, it's entrenched in the culture, so much so that a lot of people act shocked and surprised when big YouTube channels surge and get lots of subscribers, like these big Twitch streamers like ContraPoints. People want to call them feds. Like, people want to call these people feds, describe them as feds. They're not feds. No, they reaffirm the status quo positions on a shit ton of topics. Sure, they might do it with a thin red coat of leftist aesthetic. They might do it while occasionally spewing leftist rhetoric, but otherwise they reaffirm status quo positions. So why wouldn't they grow and become popular? Guys, do you know, like, if I wanted to, I've said this many times before, but I could exponentially grow this channel if I wanted to. I would just come out as a neocon tomorrow and talk about how I left the left. And I'd be good at it too, because I've actually studied communist literature, so it would be that much easier for me to manipulate people and distort the facts, and basically talk a bunch of shit about it. And I'd be a very good anti-communist propagandist. Are you kidding me? Like, I've thought about some really good anti-communist arguments in private. If I wanted to, guys, I could be a devastating propagandist in the opposite direction. But I'm not, because I actually care. So the point is, liberalism's everywhere. It's entrenched, encircled, and penetrated the minds of everyone to such a deep extent that it just reproduces itself. It's literally your brain on capitalist realism. That's a term you guys should look up, capitalist realism. So this brings me to point number 2. While first world workers are indoctrinated to an extreme extent, second and third world workers, not so much. Because capitalism hasn't penetrated the second and third world to the same degree. Capitalist psychology, that is, because there's still some sense of a commons and community in these countries, because friendships and social ties and family still matter in these countries, because capitalism has failed to take off in these countries, because it's just not as widespread. The liberal indoctrination it's not as widespread. The result is that people aren't nearly as entrenched and indoctrinated by liberalism, and as a result, they're a lot more receptive to radical rhetoric, like when you go to describe imperialism, when you describe economic phenomenon and talk about capitalism. These people are going to be a lot more likely to listen to you, because as we'll get here in a moment, they feel the brunt in much more direct ways. They're a lot more vulnerable. But the other reason is because they're just less indoctrinated. And this is the reason why the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, goes around the globe sponsoring think tanks and news outlets and radio stations and media, pumping millions of dollars into these psyops so that they can entrench liberal culture and ideology in these regions of the world where they aren't nearly as entrenched. It's the same reason why, for the last 30 years, people in Eastern Europe have been bombarded with not just liberal, but fascist propaganda, like literally nonstop. You're seeing neo-Nazi and fascist parties rise left and right in Eastern Europe. And you're seeing people taught an extremely negative and jaded history about communism, that the communists, the Reds, were evil, they ruined everything, our countries are shit because of the Reds, not because capitalism was restored. You see what I'm saying? Like, they attribute their shitty positions now to capitalism, or they attribute it to socialism, and they attribute whatever economic prosperity does go on in Eastern Europe to capitalism. And they have CIA indoctrination to thank for that. Like, that's the reason why Eastern Europe fascism is so entrenched, because it's been deliberately entrenched by CIA grifter bugs. But if you go to Africa, Latin America, or any of these other second and third world countries where liberalism isn't as entrenched, you have more of a fighting chance to radicalize people. So, moving on to point number 3. First world workers are bought off just enough to not want to revolt. Now, this is something that third worldists will say. They'll even go on to describe first world workers as net exploiters. I don't think first world workers are net exploiters. I think they're benefactors of the exploitation, but I don't think they're net exploiters. I think that's kind of weird, goofy voodoo economics. Better thing to say is that the ruling class, the imperialists, are the net exploiters, and that first world workers are passive benefactors from it just because they get to buy lots of cheap shit. So, many workers in the first world have reformist consciousness, and there's a reason for this. A lot of it comes down to class interest. Class interest. You know the old motto that Marx says? Marx says, workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Well, as it turns out, first world workers tends to have quite a bit more to lose than their chains. Not all of them. There are some first world workers that the deeper sections of the proletariat, they truly don't have anything to lose. And it's a growing demographic. I would say particularly within Black and Native American populations and Hispanic populations, as well as people who live out in the countryside away from the cities. Like a lot of these lumpenized rural poor, a lot of these rural, not just lumpenized, but just deeper sections of the proletariat in general, they have nothing to lose. They don't got shit. There is some real poverty in the first world, particularly the United States. I would go as far as to say there are pockets of third world living standards through all these sacrifice zones, Native American reservations, all these small towns where everyone worked at the factory, but then the factories packed shit up and left, and now nobody has work except at like the gas station. There's no opportunity, there's nowhere to go. So I would say, yeah, there are sects within the first world working class that do have nothing to lose, but not as substantial enough for them to constitute a revolutionary force. And here's what I mean. Most of the American population live in suburbs and apartments. Let's just talk about the suburbanites for now. Suburbanites constitute a solid chunk of American workers. Same goes with I hate that term PMC, and I'm not going to use it. I'm just going to say high-skilled workers, the well-to-do, the middle class. Let's talk about the middle class. Why are the middle class not even slightly revolutionary? Why do they tend towards reformism or fascism? The reason being is because, as it turns out, they have a lot more to lose than their chains. What do they have to lose? They have to lose their cars, their mortgages, their 401ks, their savings, their stock holdings, their 50K a year salary, and whatever little equity or financial security that they do hold on and they do have is subject to being at risk if they try to shake up the system, if they try to rock the boat. So if there's a revolt in the United States, or there was a revolt or some big strike at a company, you want to know what happens to stock line, the big green stock line? Dow Jones plummets. The red line goes down. Stocks go down. Whenever the workers start fighting for their interests, start fighting for their rights, whenever companies do pro-worker moves, it causes the stock to go down. And a lot of these middle-class workers have their 401ks, that's their retirements, invested in the stock market. They have their mortgages in the stock market. They might even have their own employee stock holdings and stock options. The point is that because of their ownership of these stocks and because they day trade and they participate in this big grand machine, it is now in their interest to make sure that the green line goes up and it doesn't go down. So that's just one example of the many examples I'm talking about. And I'm not even saying life as a middle-class American is great. Middle-class American life is woefully overrated. Yeah, you make like $60K a year if you're lucky. But if you have kids, if you have like even one kid, that's an average of like 20K a year off your salary. Like the average American pays about 230, $240,000 between years 1 and 18 with their kids. Like how much it costs to raise kids in this day and age. And not only that, you got to consider mortgage, car insurance, auto repairs, like maintaining your vehicle, car payments, credit card debt, student loan debt. When you consider all of the necessities of life being as fucking expensive as they are, no wonder why GDP per capita is highest in the United States. It's because we pay so goddamn much for all this overpriced bullshit that we need in order to participate in a modern life. So, but regardless, I'm not saying it's great, is my point, but it's good enough and it's comfy enough to where people don't want to go out of their comfort zone, and it's comfy enough to where people, they have enough at stake to where they don't want to put anything on the line because it's all they have. They've been working their entire lives for it, and they're not about to give it up, even on the promise that things could be better 10 to 20 years down the line. There's an element of sacrifice, collective sacrifice, first worlders are going to have to make when the transition to socialism is complete. And we'll get to that later. And people simply aren't willing to make that sacrifice, even if it means securing the long-term stability of humanity, long-term stability of their kids and their kids' kids. So this brings me to a couple historical events. Let's talk about the Great Depression. Talked about the Great Depression and the Civil Rights Movement with Veritas in my debate, debate works. We talked about that for a good long time, and I talked about how the reason why left-wing activists and revolutionaries in the First World have struggled to such a difficult degree in order to develop any sort of revolutionary force and class consciousness is because of the capitalist system's ability to give concessions, strategic concessions, when need be. So even if workers were to rise up and start fighting, there is a degree, a flexible degree. It not very flexible, but it's flexible enough to where concessions can be levied if people force the government to levy those concessions. But these concessions are granted as means to peel away the more moderate, liberal elements of the movement. That's why they give the concessions. That's what the civil rights movement was, or the Civil Rights Act. That's what the abolition of Jim Crow was. That's what a lot of these like little concessions and reforms that's what FDR's New Deal was. It was all a concession, a bribe, because these first world countries, the ruling class are wealthy enough to the point to where if you force their hand and you give them the alternative between reform or get overthrown, they're going to choose reform most of the time. So because of that, because these concessions, they peeled away the less radical components of the movement, dwindling down their numbers, making it easier for the powers that be to crack down on the most radical components of the movement. Hence why we have the long history of the Agent Provocateur, COINTELPRO, Operation Garden Plot. This is a fun one. Operation Garden Plot, the United States government. If the 1960s style Vietnam protesting and civil rights protesting were to continue into the 70s, the US government was planning on unleashing the army on 25 major population centers to, by brute force, quell all of the protesting. That's if it were to continue in the 70s. Look up Operation Garden Plot. The US government was ready to unleash the army on the general populace to stop the protesting and uprising. So, anywho, so next point. Point number 4. While the first world workers have something to lose, second, more specifically, third world workers have virtually nothing to lose most of the time. Like, even if you take, like, the point, like, living standards are improving globally, neolibs will say, like, see, global extreme poverty is being reduced, capitalism works. You're going from living on $2 a day to $3 a day. Woo! You're going from $3 a day to $5 a day. Woo! Incredible gains, incredible progress, right? Capitalism does pull hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. If you ignore how the IMF twists and contorts poverty statistics to mask and hide the poverty and show that outside of certain select countries like China and India, it really hasn't gotten that much better. In some areas, it's actually gotten worse, like in sub-Saharan Africa. But I digress. The point is that capitalist psychology is not as entrenched in the third world. People are losing fingers working factories. They're going to work much younger. They're working 12, 14-hour insane shifts doing this extremely labor-intensive outsourced manual laborer, making computer parts and growing coffee and uh, manufacturing goods, light industry goods, consumer goods, high-tech consumer goods. What are some good examples? The textile industry, like in Bangladesh, and they're working 12-hour days, 6 days a week, 13, 14-hour days, 15-hour days sometimes, doing labor-intensive manufacturing work, working ungodly hours, and out of all those hours that they're working, they're statistically only getting paid 50 to 60% of what their wages ought to be in order for them to actually cover the cost of having a roof over their head and putting food on the table. Yeah, they're paid starvation wages and they get worked to death in factories. So they're slanted to die sooner, die younger. They're slanted to have to provide their whole family on a measly like pennies an hour paycheck. So they've got nothing to lose. Let's say capital enters crisis in these countries. It's not like in the first world, capital enters crisis. No, there goes my mortgage and my 401k and my finances. No, my automobile payments. No, my job, my good paying job, my comfy life. My comfy life. No, fuck this. I want to keep capitalism going. More preferably, I want to do a fascism and go back to when the world made sense. That's what the middle class will trend towards. Fascism. Because that's when the world made sense. That's when there was social cohesion of some sort, and when, the straight, white, red-blooded, cisgendered, Christian, heterosexual male was on top. They don't give a fuck that everybody else were treated like second-class citizens, but they were on top, and that's all that mattered. And they had their good-paying jobs. They could work, make comfy money, come home, chastise their wife and ask her why she hasn't made him a sandwich yet. Tell that bitch to get back in the motherfucking kitchen. And no, but those good old days are gone. Now things are changing. So while the middle class trends towards fascism and reaction, first world workers, not first world, but the deep sections of the proletariat in the first world, and if you go to the even deeper sections of the proletariat in the third world, they trend towards left populism, they trend towards socialism, they trend in our direction, they trend towards communism. They are much more receptive to radical socialist rhetoric as a result, because, what's going to happen if capitalism in Bangladesh fails? I'm a young woman in Bangladesh. I work 75 hours a week. Capitalism fails. All right. What's going to happen? I'm going to lose my non-existent 401k. I'm going to lose my non-existent health care. I'm going to go from working a fuckload of hours, getting paid total shit, to having all the free time in the world. And all that's going to happen is I'm going to go from making next to nothing to making nothing at all. Yeah. Oh, that's such a massive drawback. I'm saying that because people have a lot less invested in the system in the third world, they are substantially more likely to rebel against it. So that's my point. Now for the last points. Point number 5. Going through these bullet points as fast as I can. Socialism in the third world, first world rather. Excuse my French. Socialism in the first world, particularly America, would be impossible. That's my last point. And here's what I mean by this. So let's say third worldism's wrong. Okay. Third worldism's wrong. Let's say, pretend for a moment it's wrong, and there's some hidden variable or factor that we're not accounting for here, and that Americans are actually the most revolutionary of them all, and Americans do a socialism. They make socialism domestically in the United States. I'm using America because I'm an American. I don't know as much about the conditions of Western Europe or any of these other countries. Sorry for my comrades internationally. But speaking specifically for the United States, it would be very difficult to outright impossible to actually construct socialism in this country. And let me explain why. Number one, workers in the United States are de-skilled. There's no autarky. There's no self-sufficiency. People have been trained to work these service jobs and these bullshit jobs that don't actually serve any social or productive function. A lot of it is just people doing bullshit, running around doing bullshit for the sake of bullshit. People don't know how to hunt. People don't know how to grow their own food. They don't know how to organize, fix things. They don't even know how to find resources. They don't know how to do the basic things that you would know how to do in order to survive off the grid. Your average American does not know how to do these things. And the second, hell, dude, we don't even know how to fix our own shit. Like, we don't care to. Let's say this mic breaks or this cup breaks. Anything we break, we have been trained. Yes, we have been trained to throw it away and buy another one. We don't fix anything that we buy. We don't fix any of this shit. We think that water grows on trees, and same with this keyboard and this desktop. We think that cups grow on trees. We think that when we throw them in the trash, they go into the abyss. They just cease to exist. They return to the ether from which they came. But this is not the case at all. This shit had a source. It all comes from the earth, imbued with human labor time and effort. So these things, we don't repair or fix any of our own shit. We don't know how to do any of this ourselves. And I'm not saying people can't learn, but just people don't have any self-sufficiency. There's no self-sufficiency. There's no sense of solidarity. There's no organizational cohesion. Hell, when we had the uprisings, the George Floyd uprisings of 2020, it was really just people cathartically lashing out because they were trapped in fucking quarantine for 2.5 months. And then they see George Floyd die and they're all at home. They can't pay their bills. They're way behind on all their shit. And then that's when people go ape shit and they flip the fuck out. But because there's no social cohesion, organization, there's not even any demands being made. People lash out and they make all the rich people in the country scared and they all flee the country. And then what happens from there is shit eventually fizzles out. Joe Biden gets elected, promising all these reforms that he never delivers on. All the liberals are like, oh, I'm a retard and I vote blue no matter who. And they all go home. And the less radical and more moderate components of the movement get peeled away because a nice, safe, centrist moderate is promising a return to normal. I'm telling you guys right now, for the far left in the United States, Trump is the greatest gift that the establishment has ever given to us. Under Donald Trump, rates of radicalization were high. The more moderate liberal components were turning out, so we had greater numbers. People were getting radicalized. People see the system for the bullshit that it is, and we actually had an opportunity to levy some concessions from the system. But unfortunately, now Trump is gone. Now we have Biden in, and exactly what I predicted, I must be psychic, I predicted this. Biden was going to become president, and all the libs were going to go home. But that's fine because who we're left with are the people that actually care. But the point is that actually there really is no point. There's no solidarity. There's no organization. There's no ideological cohesion. People just cathartically lash out and go home. And when there is any sort of organization, it's in the complete opposite direction, fascism. So that's another thing we got to deal with. Also, this is a big one. This country's infrastructure is fucking bullshit. The United States and our infrastructure has been designed specifically and solely for the accommodation of the automobile. We have gone from mass transit via trains, subways, buses, to the fading out of that in the 1930s so that we can all be forced to buy cars. It is something that should be a public good, has been transformed into a private service. And now we have to buy cars, get our insurance if we don't want to be stranded or have to take the Shoelace Express to get anywhere. And you're not going to be able to take the Shoelace Express because of how spread out everything is, how far away everything is. And even if it wasn't far, a lot of our roads and highways don't have sidewalks. They don't have a way. You can get fucking arrested if you get caught walking on the highway. Like, so there's nothing in place that's friendly for using your feet to commute. You need a car to commute. There is no mass public transit. And we no longer have mass delivery via train. Now we have delivery through these on-time delivery schedules by the trucking industry. Trucks deliver goods, have a constant trickle of goods coming in, being poured into the cities, being dependent on these on-time deliveries on the spot and then going back. So my point is that because of our infrastructure, because there's like no mass transit of any kind, because of neoliberalism, like we've lost most of our manufacturing. My point is that there's no means of production to seize, and that you can only travel so far on foot to take and hold territory. I mean, let's say there's a socialist uprising in the United States. What are we going to seize? What are we going to take control of? What buildings are we going to occupy? The Sunoco down the street? The Walmart over there? I mean, where's the factories? Where is the means of production? There's no means of production to seize. I mean, they're just out of the cities most of the time, and they're out in the countryside. Yeah, and so, I mean, I'm not saying we don't have manufacturing, but our country is so spread out and so spread thin that without any sort of external material support, we don't stand a chance. We won't even be able to take and hold territory. Like, logistically, it's not going to fucking work. So that's the other issue, for logistics reasons as well. Just the United States, the ruling class have done everything in their power, both directly and indirectly, to fuck any chance for socialism in this country and fuck any chance of the left actually posing a threat or taking and holding any power. So that's my point. We import a ton of our food, commodities, and resources. If, let's say a branch of, let's say California becomes California, not neoliberal formula, like it actually is. Let's say it's actually existing California. Let's say that happens. All the U.S. government would have to do is starve them out, just sanction them, just do siege. The entire population of California will be starving within a week. See what I'm talking about? So in that regard, even if we take control of significant amounts of territory, what's left of the U.S. government could starve us out. Our supply lines are contingent, and they're really fragile too. Like, if you think about it, having like trucks deliver shit versus a train is a lot less efficient. It takes more energy per capita, and it's a lot more vulnerable. Like, raiders hit the road and they steal some trucks. You're costing a grocery store weeks worth of supplies when you do that. So extremely vulnerable, extremely weak infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, virtually non-existent manufacturing. The city design is fucking horrible. So that's my point. So moving on. So those are pretty much my 5 points. But before we move on to the next point, like what we can do about it, I'm going to read some comments. Not to mention that that's the point I made earlier. Americans are manipulated. They're propagandized. So that's my main point. Now let us move on. Technically, the climate will eventually eliminate the food production and starvation will be the norm. Oh, yeah, no. I'm not looking forward to those days. Honestly, dude, I think we're going to run out of food before we run out of water. I think we're going to see the water wars a lot sooner. So, last comment I'm reading. What I say is true, but it's also not correct to claim that sufficient poverty and miseration is somehow how mechanically make revolutions inevitable. I just gave like 5 different reasons why the conditions are way more ripe in the third world. And it goes beyond immiseration and poverty. It's the fact that capitalism is not as entrenched in the third world. It hasn't taken off in these countries. It has either failed that's pretty much it. It's failed, or it's failed to take off. It's failed to lock. And not only that, but like the conditions of these people that they face. Like, I'm just saying, dude, that people have a lot less to lose in the second and third world by rebelling. So now let's move on and talk about solutions, because I think the 40-minute mark is the perfect mark. Let me have my coffee next. Talking about my points. All right. So with that in mind, what do we do about it? How do we combat and resist a tide, a colossal tide of liberal indoctrination and culture that runs so deep and is so heavily embedded and entrenched in the population of a country comprising hundreds of millions of people, that people don't know their dick from their ass anymore? How do we fight back against it? How do we resist the tide and the incoming tide of reaction? And how do we impact meaningful change? How are we to do revolution in the first world? So this is where I'm going to bring up a point that I brought up about 35 minutes ago, but the way that we combat it, the way that we change things, is that we build resistance within the first world. All right. And here's what this means. All right. We'll get to that in a second. But more importantly than resistance, we need a new international movement. So what this means is we need to get in touch with communists in the second and third world. And we need to start providing them with material and critical support. So what does this mean? It means we're going to need to pick up some languages. We're going to need to learn some new languages, learn Hindi, learn Russian, I suppose Chinese would be useful too. That way you can talk to the far left within China. I think learning Chinese would be useful, but really Spanish would be a huge one. If you learn Spanish, you can talk to a huge chunk of the planet's population. Point is, learn some languages, or either we are or some of us are going to have to devote becoming translators. So there's that. Learning other languages so that we can communicate and get in contact with revolutionaries in the third world and grant them material support. Because we live in the land of opportunity, there is a much greater opportunity for us to accumulate wealth, accumulate resources and assets, and take some of the spoils of that imperialist plunder, seize it either by illegal or extra legal means, and send it back to our third world comrades so that they can use it for organizing, propagandizing, and making their movement successful. Time is money, resources are money, and money is resources. So giving these people what they need in order to make their revolutions successful will allow them to, make their revolutions successful. So providing material support and having an international movement and having things organized on a global stage. That is what we eventually need to work to. And it's a colossal task, but it needs to be done. Fortunately, we have some advantages on our side. One of them being the internet. See, with the click of a button, light speeds, you can contact people on the other side of the world faster than ever before. So with that being said, here are some of the tasks that first world revolutionaries and socialists should be concerned with. All right. So on top of getting in contact with hotbed countries, as I call them, hotbed countries of communist activity where there's high revolutionary potential, some of these examples include India, Kazakhstan, Ghana, South Sudan, and most of Latin America. On top of that, we need to focus on reskilling workers in the first world and cultivating class consciousness and solidarity within the first world as well. Because despite the indoctrination, despite the elevated living standards and the spoils of imperialist plunder, the rot of capitalism and neoliberalism is more obvious than ever before. Like, the contradictions are emerging left and right. Like, people are becoming increasingly aware that something is seriously wrong, and they're starting to see writing on the wall. And it's as evidenced by the increased degrees of political polarization that this is a phenomenon. This is a trend. So what must we do? Radicalizing people and bringing as many people into the fray as possible, educating people on Marxism. I mean, even if we don't turn these people into hardcore cadres, some Marxism would definitely be beneficial. So educate and aware as many people as possible. Try to organize whatever we can locally within our communities and municipalities. Try to cultivate some sort of solidarity within our local areas. Right now, I'm just trying to form a reading group, but I really need to get off my ass and start volunteering for some soup kitchens while I'm still unemployed, but that's a different conversation. I mean, it's hard work, like it really is, and there's not a lot of payoff. It's something that we all got to stick with and come together to do. So, on top of trying to cultivate solidarity, class consciousness, and doing just local organizing, just local shit. Don't try to form the next great party. Don't try to form the PSL or the Revolutionary Communist Party. Don't try to form these big tent orgs, which barely get anywhere and really just are good for showing up at protests. Just local shit. Local, basic, small shit. As small as you can think of. Be it a communal kitchen, be it a communal refrigerator, a communal tool shed, be it providing people with some non-market means of subsistence and support so that we bring back the sense of a commons and we establish the material basis for some sort of socialist consciousness. That's the idea. Moving on, reskilling workers, teaching people to be self-sufficient, teaching people how to recycle, reuse tools, and be educated, because we actually need to be really well educated if we plan on running a country someday. Like, we're going to need a lot of people who know how to do these important high skill tasks. I mean, from programming's one, being able to fix things and maintain and repair things is another. Being able to grow food, just medical training, just these basic high skill services that would come in super fucking handy within the context of a commune or the context of a revolutionary org. They never stress. I noticed this. The RCPs, the PSLs, the CPUSAs, the PCUSAs. Why aren't they training people how to do engineering work? Why aren't they training people how to be field medics? Why aren't they training people how to shoot a gun, how to grow food? I never understand that. Like, we need to reskill workers because these high skill tasks are going to be absolutely essential when the time comes. That's another point. And then yet another point. Let's talk reforms. Revolution and reform. All right. Since revolution is a far off goal in the United States or the first world in general, what we should instead be focusing on is strategic reforms which pave the way for revolution down the line. And I can think of a number of these reforms off the top of my head, and I will go through those reforms with you. But for now, I am thirsty. I will be right back. I'm going to go get some water. All right, where were we? Yes. Moving on. So let's talk about some reforms, some strategic reforms that are worth organizing around. And when I mean these reforms, I mean like forming orgs which specifically specialize in making these reforms happen. All right. Creating political pressure for these things to happen. So, what are some examples? Well, one of them is decommodification, getting essential life supporting goods out of the fucking market. A couple examples: housing, education, healthcare. Yeah, housing, education, healthcare. These are frankly pretty easy agitation points nowadays anyways. I mean, most Americans are on board with tuition-free college. Most of them are already on board with some affordable housing and single payer. You just take this rationale to its logical conclusion. Call for the decommodification of these things. Get these things out of the hands of the market. And that will, once again, provide more material basis for socialist consciousness. Because you're getting these things out of the market. Really, that's what we need to focus on. Decommodification, pulling essential life supporting goods out from the market. So that's a reform right there. In fighting for higher wages, $15 minimum wage, not enough anymore. We need to start advocating for a $20 minimum wage, $25 minimum wage if you live in New York or California. So yeah, higher wages is a big one. That's a huge one right there. Organizing and agitating around that. Shorter work weeks. We are living in the age where we can send rockets to Mars and split the atom. Why the fuck are people still working 40 hours a week? You know, for all this talk of we need a higher minimum wage, why is there no talk of why are we still working 40 hours a week in the most industrially productive age in the entire history of humanity? There's why, like, we're living in the service economy. We had economists that were predicting back in the 30s, like John Maynard Keynes predicted this, that we were going to be on 15 to 20 hour work weeks by the year 1999. So what the fuck happened? Why aren't work weeks getting shorter? So higher wages, shorter work weeks, decommodification, and what else? Well, defunding the police. Defunding the police. Yeah, you heard me. Now, the cringe, beta cuck liberal take on this is that the police should have their funding increased. That way they have more resources. That way they get mental health training. They get body cams. That way they can more effectively do their job. That way police can be better at policing. That way we can maybe hold them accountable. My attitude is fuck that. Police already in a solid majority of states get most of the funding. Like when it comes to sciences, when it comes to social programs, when you take the pie, the whole pie, policing on average constitutes like 40 to 60% of the pie. Yeah, they already get paid a metric fuck ton. So I say pay them less, give them less resources, and give them less of what they need to do their jobs. Because what are the police? They're the frontline defense of the dictatorship of capital. These are the guys that are there to enforce the law and protect private property. They are not legally obligated to protect you or to guard your life. In a freaking Supreme Court case, it was ruled in that favor. Cops are not obligated to protect you. They're only obligated to enforce the law and protect private property. They are the personal army of the ruling class state. So in that regard, defunding them makes them less effective. It makes it so there are fewer of them, that they have fewer resources, that they have fewer tanks, gas canisters, machine guns, body armor, fewer numbers, less wages, less reason for people to be cops, makes the system less stable, less entrenched, is the general idea. So yeah, I'm in favor of defunding the police. Defund those motherfuckers. Disarm, defund, demilitarize. You can turn that into a poster if you want to. What else? What are some other good reforms? Oh, this is the other one I listed. Overturning right to work. So, wrong cup. That was my coffee cup. But overturning the right to work is another big one. The reason why many states can't or don't unionize is because of right to fire. They can fire you for whatever reason they want. But if we could overturn right to work in many of these states, if we could overturn many of these anti-union laws, who knows? We might see the material basis set for the reconstruction of something resembling a union movement. But it's going to require getting some of these laws out of the fucking way. So yeah, overturning of various laws and strategic laws and democratic reform. That's the last one I had on this list. Increasing democratic reform and expanding the amount of democratic control and say that the general populace has in the political making process will make the implementation of a lot of these popular policies possible. It will make a lot of it happen sooner, quicker, easier. This is the general idea, because when there's an expansion of democratic rights and democratic control, when people actually have like a say in the political process, you're going to find that people are going to enact a lot of things that frustrate the ruling class. So I'm saying that we, when it comes to the people that are relatively class consciousness, when it comes to these left liberals, or when it comes to people who are of a similar consciousness or maybe even further left, they just don't know it yet. Like, there are radical components within the broader movement. We just need to take the cuck-dem reforms, the sock-dem reforms, and we basically need to expand on them. Like, we can't just struggle for reform's sake. We should struggle for reforms because they pave the way for revolution. All right? They pave the way for the ultimate overthrow of the system. So, going back to a couple other points, I mean, besides the establishment of a material basis for non-market means of subsistence, how do higher wages and shorter work weeks increase revolutionary potential? Well, when people aren't busy working fuckloads of hours trying to pay bills, when people actually have time to sit down and think about things, when people have time to actually take an interest in what's going on in their community and the world around them, they tend to notice how fucked things are, and they tend to become more politically conscious. I mean, shit, work weeks were shrinking during the civil rights movement in the Vietnam War era of the 60s. People had more free time then. What did they do? Protest more, organize more. People care when they have time, energy, and they aren't working a shitload of hours. Here, evidence exhibit number 2. Uh, 2020 COVID crisis. Third of the population is inside collecting unemployment. 2 months later, planet-wide protests, countrywide protests. See what I'm saying? When people have time and people have energy to expend doing other things and have that energy freed up, not trying to make their boss more money, then people by design are going to have more time to like think and organize and actually give a shit. Nobody wants to turn on the news after they've been working 8 to 10 hours. They just want to stay entertained. They want to play video games. That's my point. So, let's see what else. Oh yeah, local elections. Running people in local elections is good. Should we participate in elections? Yes, we should. We should run our own candidates. We should run our own people in local elections because people vastly underestimate how important it is to have people who care about the working class holding the levers of power within their local communities and municipalities. I mean, people vote, people partake, and we should run our own independent left-wing candidates as mayors, city council seats, and so on, because it will give them sway and influence to positively impact people's lives. So, like I said, we should struggle for reform in the short term, but to pave the way for revolution later. We shouldn't struggle for reform's sake, like the tailists of the movement are at this time. So, this is pretty much a guide to elevating class consciousness, what should be done in the short term, and at a bigger stage, we can eventually come together and start, like I said, providing material support, making sure that the revolutions are successful in the third world while struggling for vital resources and reforms in the first world. And let's say there's a wave of revolutions. US government goes to sanction, clamp down, invade. It's going to be at us to be at the forefront of the anti-war movement, anti-imperialist movement. And what this means is extra legal activities or legal activities. Extra legal, what I mean by that, the general strike, occupying and shutting down war factories, sabotaging industrial equipment used to build bombs and guns and weapons. Point is that you frustrate the ability for the imperial core to basically bomb these countries and ruin their chances of doing socialism, and you provide material support. Does that sound risky? Yes, it does. But again, I mean, that's part of what being an actual revolutionary is about. You're willing to make risks. You're willing to make sacrifices and take risks for a pretty far off goal. And we need to get more people in that are willing to do that so that we can have a more positive impact on the world. Yeah, but it mostly starts with us just going outside and doing the work. So Yeah, I mean, these thoughts could have been organized probably a little bit better, but my point is if you make the revolution successful in the third world, then they are going to start sending material support to us and they're going to provide resources to us and some of their power and their energy to us in the first world to help us organize. And if we lay the groundwork through these essential reforms and we are like the groundwork like through decommodification and through the establishment of a material basis for socialist consciousness, and we're also getting help from this new camp of socialist countries. On one hand, the first world is going to start to get starved of its source of cheap exports, like because we get a bunch of our cheap raw minerals, cheap commodities, and food from these countries. They can cut us off. They can cut off the first world from their source of exploitation. First world enters crisis, and when it enters crisis, people become a lot more receptive to radical rhetoric in both the left and the right direction. And from there, it's on us, on top of the fact that we are now getting imports and material support from this camp of successful socialist countries. Since we're the ones getting it, and since the capitalist system is in severe crisis, we're going to have the upper hand under that scenario if we've been building up to it long enough and we play our cards right. So that's the general idea. You make them successful, you help them out, and in turn, they will come back and help you out. And that's pretty much the order it's got to go in, because America's probably going to be one of the last countries on earth to finally go socialist, but we're going to have to drag all the reactionaries kicking and screaming to the civilized era, but we can do it. We can do it. Anyways, so that's my TED Talk. That's all I had to say about that. If you want to see my stream notes, they're right here. Check this shit out. So yeah, these are my stream notes. I'm going to kill the stream here in a minute, but before I do, do you guys have any questions? Let's scroll up. 5:11 p.m. Do you think that it's problematic that a lot of American socialists are upper middle class, college educated people? Working class representation matters. Well, yeah, well, there's a few different reasons why that is. I think that a lot of people turn to leftism and just politics in general in these spheres as a form of escape. It's not so much material necessity as it is a form of escape for some people, I feel. On the other hand, a lot of these college students and these upper class people, they have time on their hands to think about these things and time on their hands to take the time to educate themselves and learn. Bear in mind that many successful revolutionaries hail from the middle class. Like Lenin was the son, like he was the descendant of a middle class aristocrat, like a well-to-do aristocrat. He was a well-off lawyer. Frederick Engels was the manager and son of a factory owner. And who else? Mao was wealthy, was part of a wealthy peasant family. Che Guevara and Castro both have middle class backgrounds. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with being middle class. I mean, I don't think it makes you more or less revolutionary inherently. Or I mean, yeah, I agree that representation matters. But in general, some of the most successful socialist leaders have roots amongst the middle or upper class. So you'd be surprised. What else? What else do we got? PT always governed with support of neolibs. I don't know who PT is. Stalin was the only real low-class representative. Yeah, no, he came from a broke-ass peasant family. But do you think that in light of the U.S. student debt crisis, the student debtors will have revolutionary potential of their lifelong indentured servitude and class interests? I mean, yeah, I would say on some level, yeah, because student loan, I mean, one, you're not guaranteed a job after college. You're just not. The profits giveth and the profits taketh, and they're going to have to think of increasingly mundane, benign, and arbitrary means to exclude high-skilled workers and degrees from various positions in order to justify those high wages, in order to justify that 70K a year salary. All of a sudden, it's not enough for you to have your bachelor's. Now you got to have a 3.0 GPA. Now you have to be 6 foot even. Now you have to have squeak clean record with no driving infractions. Now you got to be able to tiptoe on your fingers, on your index fingers, and jump through 20 hoops of fires while doing backflips and riding a unicycle. My point is they raise the qualifications to justify the higher wages, and that leaves a bunch of people excluded. So in that regard, yeah. When it comes to revolutionary demographics, I would say people who have racked up all the student loan debt and they don't have any occupational, like their job prospects are looking like shit, then I would say so, yeah. To me, the most revolutionary demographics in the United States, I would include them among it. Just these reserve armies of people that aren't profitable to employ, but for capitalism to just let them die and provide no sort of welfare to these people at the same time, these reserve pools of people, would lead to widespread civil unrest. So to some extent, they do have to give in to certain concessions just to keep people from rebelling. But in that regard, the demographics to me that seem the most revolutionary, I mean, I would say the big three are service workers. I'm particularly referring to people who make between $10 to $15 an hour, just plain basic bitch service workers. African Americans, Native Americans. Native Americans are the most revolutionary of them all because, well, we stole their land, guys. They want their land back, so they have a direct material incentive to overthrow the government more so than anybody else. They are on these shitty reservations, third world living conditions, pockets of third world in the first world, and it's not improving. My point is that they're a conquered, defeated people, and that they are revolutionary, but the problem is they don't constitute a large enough portion of the population in order to overthrow the U.S. government. There just aren't enough of them, and same goes for African Americans. But I have found that when I've talked to many Black and brown people, indigenous people, and I use socialist rhetoric, they tend to be more receptive than white people, but not always. I mean, I've met white people in my income bracket who are not receptive to socialism at all. I've talked to well-to-do, six-figure a year salary, professional middle-class workers that love the idea of socialism, that love the idea of worker ownership. I mean, you can't. I try not to stereotype too much. I mean, obviously, we got to take this by an individual case-by-case basis, but certain demographics are going to be more receptive and tends to be more receptive than others for material reasons. Do you think what's going on with Omicron, this will radicalize more people? I mean, yeah, and I think it's radicalizing people right now in the wrong direction. We've got this weird amalgamation of populist, not really socialist, not really communists, for lack of a better word, red brown pseudo fascists that's being cultivated within the Jimmy Dore grift, as well as all these other small channels, brocialist channels, these incel mass shooters in the making, LARPing as leftists. Not going to name any names, of course, but yeah, no, it's radicalizing people. It's just creating a type of opportunist tailism more than anything else. What culture does America have that is split? It's all just consumerism and atomization at this point. Mostly optics, aesthetics, more than anything else. It's really just appearances, I believe. It's a meme. It's a meme. Let's see what we got here. You guys got anything else for me? What culture does America have to split? What does land back mean? It means getting the United States to adhere to the fucking treaties that they signed in the first place. Because at this moment, the U.S. government and private firms are in violation of, like, I don't know, 528 out of the 530 land treaties that the natives in the U.S. signed. We sign these treaties and we just take the land from them anyways. That's basically what's been happening over and over again. So land back is really just kind of a reform, like a token reform to get Native American or the United States government to adhere to their own treaties, basically. And that will entail giving Indians back a lot of land. The last book I read was Triumph of Evil by Austin Murphy. But alongside that, recently I've been paying visits to another one called Stalinist Terror: New Perspectives. It's a more up-to-date version of Getty's Origins of the Great Purge. I've also been reading a little bit of this other book, which is a biography of Napoleon Bonaparte called Napoleon: A Life. I've got the book lying around right here, actually. You guys want to see my book? Yeah, this is what I've been reading before bed here and there every night. See that? Napoleon, Mr. Bonaparte. That's what I'm talking about, man. Little Bonapartism. So you guys are telling me there's no split? Oh, fuck yeah, there's a split. Not just among the people, not just between left and right. I mean, there's a split between individuals as well. Americans fucking hate each other. Not just hate, but are afraid of each other, are atomized and isolated. Everyone just lives in these little fucking bubbles. And you can try to come into people's bubbles. And I'm not saying you can't make friends, but people are massively estranged from one another in this culture, even between family members, and it's pretty scary. I think by your own admission, it's middle class people that are more likely to become radicalized. I mean, I don't think it can go either way though. That's the thing. Like I said, it can go either way. But the big issue within the context of the United States is really just the fact that capitalism is as entrenched as it is, and that people are materially in a position like if you're a middle class person from an earlier capitalist era, I mean, it's going to hurt if the system gets overthrown. But here in the United States, if capitalism gets overthrown and you're middle class, you're going to be fucked. Your living standards, or at least your personal wealth, is going to come down. It's going to come down because no more stock market. Now, that's not to say people wouldn't benefit in the long term, but when it comes to the United States and this movement as a whole, people in the first world, particularly in America, people who actually want socialism are going to have to live with some sacrifices. Some sacrifices are going to have to come in the short term. And I know some people are going to be throwing Malthusian around. That's Malthusian. You want people to live more austere and poor. No, I'm saying that realistically, with the collapse of supply lines and with the ecological strain that is going on, we need to transition away from a consumer economy and rethink what it means to have a quality, wealthy life. GDP has fuck all to do with quality life. I mean, not completely fuck all, but I'm saying it's not really that great of a metric. Americans have the highest GDP on the planet. We lag behind in healthcare, life expectancy, infant mortality, uh, school grades, homelessness, social alienation. We've got fucking people shooting each other left and right. We've got gun violence. Just saying. You might be a city builder, but I'm a bodybuilder, God damn it. Check that out. But anyways, I'm a bodybuilder. Let all the city builders do their thing, all right? If the city builders don't want anything to do with me, that's fine. I'm going to be in my corner creating bodybuilders. You guys can do your city building. I'm going to do my bodybuilding. To each his own. Yeah, they have a lower literacy rate than Cuba, and our grades slip a few points every single year. We're pitifully behind the rest of the developed world. It's fucking ridiculous. Thoughts on the MPA? You've got to define these things for me, bro. I'm not familiar. National Justice Party. Is that it? What is the last book? Back to that comment, all I'm going to say on that is people like Lenin are the exception, not the rule. That's all. New People's Army. Oh, hell yeah. Let me Google this shit. Google flu. New People's Army. What do we got here? Oh, the New People's Army. The Communist Party of the Philippines. Now, is it Philippine? Is it not? I'm trying to think which party was it or that took control and actually had a revolution, but then just turned into a bourgeois democracy. I don't think it was the Philippines. It's another country with a P in its name that's Southeast Asian. I don't remember. Fucking hell, I can't remember the name of the country. Is it the Philippines? New People's Army, the Maoist Revolution. Yeah, no, I see it. I'm looking at their Wikipedia article now. So I think it might be the Philippines, but one of these countries or Maoist groups took and held power, and they just basically did liberal democracy and Dangism. I don't remember if it's the Philippines or not, though. Office of the new president designing the MPA, the terrorist group that designated the CPP, NPA as foreign terrorist organizations. Yeah, so a little commentary on traditional Maoism or guerrilla warfare. I don't know how viable guerrilla warfare is or how universal it is because it does not seem very universal to me. I think urban warfare is, if anything resembling guerrilla warfare is going to happen, I think it's going to be more urban or manifest within the cities than it is within the countryside. Just because there haven't really been, like, you have all these Maoist groups that have been doing protracted people's war for decades. Many of them haven't really gotten that far. They're still around, but they haven't seized power anywhere and they're just stuck in the mud. In some cases, you get these psychotic death cults. Well, there's really only one case I can think of where you get a psychotic death cult, and that's the Shining Path of Peru. Nepal, thank you. That's the word. Nepal, thank you. Nipple. Nipple became a liberal democracy. But the Philippines looks like they're still waging people's war. Nice and strong. Oh, wait, ceasefire. 86, government rebels, 60-day ceasefire. April, as of 2019, Duterte unilaterally declared the end of peace talks. Oh, yeah, and they're back to guerrilla warfare. Okay. Yeah, I mean, they've got a long way to go. Unfortunately, I just don't see any of these guerrilla groups getting that far anytime soon. In the time being, like I said, we need an international movement more than anything else. I mean, you could call it squirrel or feline warfare because there's lots of squirrels and kitties in the cities. Or pigeon warfare. Yeah, pigeon warfare. Protracted people's pigeon warfare. Yeah, that's what we'll call it. Well, that's what it shall be called. Anyways, at this point, I'm just sort of rambling. But in regards, keep a lookout. I've got a couple other videos I want to make. Lastly, with this shitty microphone, and then it's going to be with the Yeti mic from here on out because I'm going to be ordering a new Yeti mic. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in. Again, the reading group is going to be taking place Saturday within the Discord at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you want to learn some Marxism, if that's something you're interested in, I included the link in the description below if you want to join the Discord. 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I hope that works with as many of y'all as possible. We are going to be going through basic stuff, principles of communism, yada, yada, so on. So, again, I'm going to show the curriculum. This isn't the final curriculum, but it's a general idea of what we're going through, just as a set reminder. Close the Discord, close you. Where did you go? Where did you go? Ah, here we go. There we go. So, going through this mission statement. So, here's what we're going through. depending on the experience level of everyone that shows up, and depending on what everybody's read and what they're familiar with, some of these tomes might be skipped, and we might just go to the things that people are less familiar with first and overview that first. But otherwise, this is the curriculum. Don't be intimidated by the number of books. Most of these are only like a page or two long. Over here, be intimidated because these are all books. These are all like 100 pages or longer. This will take forever to get through. Once we finally get to studying capital, this will also take forever to get through. And when we finally hit Grundrisse and Anwar Sheikh and anti-Deering, this will also take forever to get through. But once you're through all of it, you're going to be a really good Marxist, you're going to be a strong reader, and you are going to be steeled with everything you need in order to be a good communist. So I'm still going to talk out the final curriculum, but otherwise, y'all have a nice day. Take it easy. When are we hitting the gym after reading? When you discover where I'm at.